I spoke with Boeing CEO Dennis Muilenburger back in December and asked him in the wake of that Lion Air crash in October if he had any concerns about the safety of the 737 MAX 8. Here's what he had to say.
Bottom line here, very important, is that the 737 MAX is safe. We're very confident in that. We have not changed our design philosophy. These are airplanes that are handled well in the control of the pilots. They're designed the same way our previous 737s are, take advantage of those systems. And the proof of that is you look around the world today, all of our customers are flying all of their MAXs daily around the world. The airplane is safe, and we're very confident in that.
The journal suggests, though, that there wasn't more prevalence placed on this because you are very interested in making sure that training is kept to a minimum so that it doesn't put more burden on the airlines. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, it's important as we transition from the 737 next gen, the NG, to the MAX. Part of what we wanted to accomplish was seamless training and introduction for our customers. So we purposely designed the airplane to behave in the same way. So even though it's a different airplane design, the control laws that fly the airplane are designed to make the airplane behave the same way in the hands of the pilot.
But the accusation in the newspaper article and other places I've heard was that it didn't. It was a little more of a downward pull and not as easy to manipulate by pulling back up on the rudder, on the steering.
Well, and that's, again, why it's important to use the procedure that's actually been approved for that kind of situation. That's
Which is to shut it
what
off?
we call a runaway stabilizer procedure. The approach for handling that is to hit the cutoff switches, the same exact procedure in the NG as it is in the MAX. And that's what's called out in the existing procedure, which is why we've pointed back to that with the bulletin that we recently issued.
Joining us right now is Sheila Kay Lu. She is aerospace and defense analyst at Jefferies. And Sheila, obviously very early in this investigation, still not clear what happened. But as Phil pointed out, there are some eerie similarities. What do you think?
Sure. I think the big focus, obviously, it's a tragic accident, but it's also Boeing's commercial aircraft business is about 60% of sales. The 737 is about 25% of total company sales. And it is a big part of the free cash flow driver. So that's why there's such a focus. And Dennis, in December, but also in January, when they put out guidance, they reaffirmed their position with the 737 going up in production from 52 a month to 57 a month.
Phil also pointed out the huge backlog, that there are about 5,000 of these planes on back order. It is their largest number of orders that they have to get going. What does this mean when you see China shutting down or stopping any of its fleet, any of the fleets there from flying, and when you have other airlines that are considering or doing the same?
We'll look to the FAA to see what they have to say. China's veered from the FAA previously. In November, they put out a separate bulletin for additional pilot training after the Lion Air incident. We've seen groundings with the A320neo with the Pratt engines back in March, and that was just the Indian Air Authorities. Similarly, the 787 with the battery issues, and then the DC-10 if you go back pretty far.
Hey, Phil, Dennis did talk a little bit about the pilot training, and that really has been what the question has been all about, that these changes were put into place without what some people said was enough training for these pilots. They put out this notification that you mentioned back in November, but is that enough? And are there concerns about what's happened since?
Definitely concerns, especially because you had a veteran pilot, in this case in Ethiopia, who was in charge of the aircraft. Now, we don't know the circumstances involved, and we won't know until they analyze the two black boxes that have now been recovered. But it raises the question, if he was notified, along with the rest of the flight crews for Ethiopian Airlines, and he should have known how to handle it in a certain situation, if that situation developed, and again, we don't know that's the case here, but if that situation developed, did he follow procedures? Was he able to follow procedures? Or was there something in the software and the mechanics of that airplane that caused it to continue to move down or eventually crash, as it obviously did?
Yeah, hey, Phil,
guys, we don't know for sure right now. But the similarities are so much that's why investigators say, look, it's very rare you just have coincidences with crashes.
Were there a lot of complaints from pilots about the stalling during takeoff? Because I think about Boeing, and that we think it's all these things are so safe for the last 10, 15 years, and suddenly they are addressing this issue, which I'm not saying it caused these two crashes, but we talk about it a lot. Was putting this mechanism in to prevent stalling, was that addressing a dire need that pilots were complaining about, that they're stalling all the time?
There's two things here. First of all, you're talking about a brand new 737. So the structure of it changed slightly. They moved larger engines into the plane so that it would be more fuel efficient, had to move them a little closer to the fuselage, and as a result, when the MAX 8 takes off, under certain situations, it may run into a stall situation. That's why they had the anti-stall technology put into these planes. There were not a lot of complaints, Joe, but we should point out that there were pilots who came back after the Lion Air crash and said, wait a second, this was not fully pointed out to us. Boeing has refused and said, no, we did. We told you. But a lot of pilots said, no, it was not really.
If there wasn't, I don't understand.
How many planes are there now in the U.S.?
There are 350 737 MAXs, 7,400 total 737s.
Okay, but if they were taken out of circulation in the United States, what would happen?
I think it'd be about 100 planes. In general, we'll look to see what
It'd be about 100 planes? You just said there's 300 some odd planes.
350 worldwide.
Worldwide.
Okay. Across 46 operators.
Yes.
Okay, so but I'm saying if you took them out of circulation, are we talking about major delays? What are we? I'm trying to understand what
with the 787, so you ground it and you could replace it with the 737. So it caused some strain on operators.
What about the bigger implications for Boeing? We are looking at the stock down at some points $40 this morning. It's been the biggest drag on the Dow. Is this justified at this point?
Given the magnitude of how big the 737 is for growth driver, that's what's driving the fear factor. But what we saw after the Lion Air crash was I think it was about a $25 billion hit to the market cap from October to the year end.
Right. This is different. When you've got two in a row, that's a different scenario. And again, we don't know. But if you were to follow this, if it weren't a coincidence, if it were linked to something similar, what would then be the impact?
I think we go back to the fact that Boeing invests billions of dollars in flight testing. There's thousands of hours in air flight testing. And if it was such a simple conclusion, it would have been drawn out in that.
And I wonder also, we're seeing veteran pilot, Phil, and you pointed out 8,000 hours is it's 4 years. When that's, I don't know, that's not like a 30-year pilot or something. What I'm getting at, Phil or Sheila, how often does it, after we go through everything that we possibly look at, how often is it pilot error? Isn't it that, don't we come to that conclusion a lot? Or is it do you know, Phil, or you can both? I don't
think there's any way you can say that a percentage of accidents, each one is so unique and so unusual. So it's not. There's no way of saying that. I mean, it's a number of factors that play together.
How do you guys think about the overlay, or at least the question that people have raised this morning about, in terms of China's decision to move on this as quickly as they did, whether you think it relates in any way to the overall trade war that's happening with the U.S. and China?
I think China veered back in November as well. And when you look at the 787 battery incident, individual airlines decided to ground the aircraft rather than an FAA mandate, which happened later on.
So you're saying no? You think it's completely unrelated?
It might be somewhat related to trade talks. And I think we've learned that there's multiple parties. There's a lot of factors that go into how folks are negotiating or might be thinking about what to do.
I don't. Phil, you think this is trade related?
I think it's less trade related and more safety related. I think it might play a factor, but I think the Chinese, the Indonesians, the Ethiopians, Cayman Airways, I think all of them are saying 2 accidents, very similar within 5 months of brand new airplanes. That's enough for them to say we want some answers before we are confident to put the planes up in the air.
The discussion we had here early on, just not on camera, was, I mean, would you think about getting on a 737 MAX? I mean, it probably crossed your mind.
I will admit, I'm flying tomorrow, and I looked to see what kind of plane I was flying on.
And and
that's saying nothing other than it just obviously raises.
And mine has nothing to do with China trade factors. It would be wondering whether the airline is safe. So I don't know why we need to, to make something out of what may or may not be. I don't know.
Phil, what happens next if the FAA is going to be picking up and kind of leading the charge on this? What do you anticipate will be the next steps?
I think it depends on what comes out of the flight data recorder as well as the cockpit voice recorder, and they'll be able to compare those results with what they see out of the Lion Air crash, because they already have some of those indications from those 2 black boxes. Look, if you see something that's very similar, if the investigators see that there's a problem with runaway trim and there's a problem with the stall technology there, I wouldn't be surprised if they move very quickly here. I mean, I look at
very
the
quickly
787.
to do what? To ground all of these planes, or to strip that particular?
I think it might be. I don't know if they will move to ground them, but they will move Boeing to say, you've got to give us some answers in terms of what we can do to resolve this very quickly. Now, whether or not that means grounding it immediately, but I think, as Sheila alluded to this, you go back and you look at the 787 Dreamliner battery fires. I remember the first one that happened in San Diego, and investigators as well as Boeing said, well, look, that was one incident. Let's take a look at it. Let's see what's going on. And I believe it was within maybe a week and a half. There was another plane. It was coming from Japan into Boston, and there was a fire there, and boom, they went at it right away. Because now you've got two. These things just don't happen randomly. When you have two incidents like that, the investigators like Boeing, or I'm sorry, the FAA, NTSB, they're not going to wait around. They will move very quickly.
But it's just weird because the system itself, it's not like there's a glitch or something, it doesn't seem like, Phil, because so often, I mean, how many flights have, how many successful takeoffs and landings around the world have there been on 737 MAXs where the pilots didn't have an issue? And it almost sounds like there was some type of...
Joe,
it was a faulty sensor.
Now that's a question I can't answer.
Yeah.
That's a question I can't answer. Who knows if pilots have been having problems or if it's been 100% smooth? And then you've got other factors and circumstances.
With the Indonesian
involved.
flight, that plane in particular had some problems that they had reported before. That's not the case, I think, in this situation.
So that was
with that
like
flight,
a software or sensor or something like that.
I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Phil, I think I had read earlier that was related to a faulty sensor, the original crash.
Well, they had replaced the sensor, the angle of attack sensor, which is at the front of the airplane on the outside. They had replaced that from previous flight right before the Lion Air crash. But whether or not that sensor is the cause of the Lion Air crash, we don't know. In fact, they have not come out with the conclusions in terms of what caused that accident. We're not expected to get a final report for several months in that case.
It's complicated.
But the bottom line is this, guys. The data will show them. And as soon as they put two things together, if there are two similarities, that will immediately lead investigators to say, okay, here's the issue, at least what we think is the issue that needs to be addressed immediately.
Sheila, if the carriers are looking at this today, and if they are putting out more than 50 planes a month already, those planes are going to be delivered in the months that it takes to investigate this accident. Would some of those carriers potentially push back and say, wait, you hold on to it for now, I want to wait until we get at least some sort of investigation that shows what happened with this? Would there be givebacks to the carriers in forms of refunds or rebates?
We're not there yet. Boeing will report February orders and deliveries tomorrow, so we'll see if they decide to make a comment. But
do either of you have a view that effectively, if this tragic accident were to have taken place here in the United States, whether the reaction from Boeing or the FAA would be different?
I think the NTSB and FAA are acting fairly quickly, as Phil said, and we'll see in the coming weeks what happens.
Yeah, it may be more media attention, may have been more dramatic.
Well, and I wonder whether that pressure would have changed things.
My guess is the regulator and the company are probably moving pretty aggressively. But
Andrew, I think they're moving very quickly here. I think you know how this goes. These are not unusual. Hey, it's kind of random that we had two of these within 5 months. That immediately got investigators saying something's got to be checked out here.
Phil,
so I think they're moving quickly.
Was moving the engines the way that you described? They're bigger engines and had to be. What was your description?
Because you were going with a larger, more fuel efficient engine. Because the idea behind the MAX is that you have greater fuel efficiency, greater range for these airplanes than the previous generation of the 737s. Because they are larger, you couldn't have them in the same exact spot on the wings.
So
otherwise they would be too low to the ground.
Maybe they should have made that move in the first place.
You're jumping ahead here. Right. So you had to move the engine closer to the fuselage, and as a result, because of those changes and some other technical changes in terms of how they were putting the aircraft together, it created a situation in the aerodynamics at takeoff where potentially in certain situations the airplane might go into a stall.
That's not good, right?
Yeah. Well, no, but Boeing's counter to that is, look, there are procedures that all pilots have in place that to handle this. They have been. Well, we don't know that, Joe. I mean, you're jumping to the conclusion that this is the reason that it crashed. But that's at the heart of the questions here.
It just seems like, one of the criticisms was that Boeing didn't alert the pilots to the extent that they should have, that this was in. So just creating a situation where you need to educate everyone so that something bad doesn't happen, and then you have a couple of things like this happen. It just, I'm just asking the question whether, I don't know, it seems maybe the plane seems more predisposed to having that problem. Obviously, that must be it if they had to put the system in to guard against it, Phil.
Well, and that's exactly what investigators are asking, Joe. Yeah. I mean, literally, and they'll have that flight data recorder. It'll give reams of information along with the cockpit voice recorder. I mean, was the crew fighting this? Was there something else that happened? Was there some other part of the plane that broke down? I mean, they'll know that almost immediately.
Phil, I had heard this reported earlier. I don't know the source of it, so I can't attest to its credibility. But I had heard that radar that tracked that plane did show it going up and going down pretty drastically, which would lead you to think that it could be related to something similar to Indonesia, right?
And the motion was similar to what they saw with the Lion Air crash, if you look at how it was reacting shortly after takeoff. Not exactly like it, but similar. And that's why people are saying, boy, you got one that did this, you have another that did this. Is there a problem here with this anti-stall technology that wants to force the nose of the plane lower so that it doesn't stall?